There is a house at the end of a gravel road that you probably drove past 1,000 times without ever really seeing it. The yard is a little overgrown. There is an old truck parked off to the side that hasn't moved in years. The garage door is always cracked open, and on certain nights, you could see the orange glow of a work light still burning at 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night. You might have thought the man inside was just a tinkerer. A hobbyist. Someone who couldn't sit still. But what was actually happening inside the garage was something that no app, no platform, and no corporation had any hand in. That man was running a business. He was repairing small engines, lawn mowers, chainsaws, tillers, and in a good month, he was clearing more money than some of the guys driving 40 minutes each way to the factory. Nobody called it a side hustle back then. They just called it getting by. And in small-town America, between the 1960s and the 1980s, getting by was an art form. Today we are going to take a long, honest look at 15 of those forgotten ways of making money. Not the kind of hustle that comes with an influencer tutorial or a Shopify store. We are talking about the informal economy, the cash in hand, handshake deal, word of mouth world that quietly held entire communities together before anyone had ever heard the word gig. These were not just ways to make extra cash. They were essential services. They were expressions of self-reliance. And one by one, over the course of about 2 decades, they vanished. So let us start at the beginning. Let us start at the bottom, where the barrier to entry was nothing more than a flashlight and a coffee can. Number 15. Selling nightcrawlers and live bait. If you grew up in a town anywhere near a lake, a river, or a creek worth fishing, you already know what this is. On a warm night after a good rain, the worms come up. And if you were the kind of kid, or adult, who was willing to get out there with a flashlight and a bucket at 10 o'clock at night, you could collect hundreds of nightcrawlers in a single hour. By morning, they were packed into foam cups filled with damp newspaper, and by the weekend they were sitting on a card table at the end of the driveway with a hand-painted sign. A dozen worms for 50 cents. In the 1970s, that was real money over the course of a summer. Some families ran this operation season after season, graduating to minnow tanks and leeches, eventually supplying tackle shops across the county. The overhead was nearly zero. The product walked right to your door when it rained. It was about as pure a business model as has ever existed. What killed it was mostly zoning and health regulations that started requiring commercial permits for live bait sales, along with the rise of large sporting goods chains that could offer bait cheaper than any individual household ever could. Number 14. The roadside produce stand. Drive any 2-lane highway in the rural South, the Midwest, or the Mid-Atlantic between Memorial Day and the first frost, and you would have passed them constantly. A wooden table or a truck tailgate, sometimes just a few bushel baskets on the ground. Sweet corn, tomatoes, cucumbers, peaches, watermelons. The prices were written in marker on cardboard. Some stands were staffed by a child with a jar for the money and an honor system for the change. Others were run by the farmer's wife, who could tell you which batch of tomatoes was best for canning and which was best for slicing. The money was immediate and completely off the books. A good summer could bring in what today would be equivalent to several $1,000s, all without ever filing a form or opening a bank account. What slowly ended the roadside stand was the same force that ended a lot of things in small-town America, the arrival of the big box grocery store, with its year-round produce section and its prices that even a hard-working family garden could not compete with. Number 13. Firewood sales. This one had a season, and that season was brutal. From late summer through early fall, a man with a chainsaw, a truck, a hydraulic splitter, and enough land or timber access could run one of the most profitable informal businesses in the county. Cords of hardwood, oak, hickory, cherry, stacked and seasoned, advertised by a sign at the end of the road or by word of mouth alone. In areas where wood heat was the primary source of warmth, this was not a luxury purchase. Families depended on it. The firewood man was as important as any utility. 2 cords delivered and stacked could pay a month's mortgage in the mid-1970s. Today that same 2 cords, adjusted for inflation, would be worth around $400. The decline of firewood as a side hustle came as natural gas lines expanded into rural areas and forced air heating systems became more affordable, pulling family after family away from the wood stove and the cast iron radiator. Number 12. Scrap hauling. There has always been money in metal, and the men who knew that, really knew it, treated scrap hauling like a second career. With a flatbed truck and a willingness to show up when someone needed a refrigerator, a washing machine, or a pile of old fence posts removed from their property, a scrap hauler could fill a truck bed in a single afternoon. The trip to the scrap yard at the end of the week might net anywhere from $20 to $100 depending on what you had collected and what the market was doing. Some haulers got so good at sourcing that they built relationships with demolition crews, machine shops, and farmers who would call them first when anything metal needed to go. The work was physical, sometimes dangerous, and completely unregulated. What changed the game was the rise of organized recycling programs and large-scale scrap operations that began undercutting the independent hauler while simultaneously raising the bar for safety and compliance. Number 11. Door-to-door tool sharpening. Picture a man walking up to your back door with a converted bicycle wheel mounted on a wooden frame, foot pedals driving a grinding stone. He would ring the bell or knock and ask, simply, if you had any knives that needed sharpening. Scissors, kitchen blades, garden shears, hunting knives, he would do them all, right there in the driveway, while you watched sparks fall off the stone like tiny orange stars. The price was maybe a quarter per blade, maybe 50 cents for a good hunting knife. But he might stop at 30 houses in a single day, and in a town of any size at all, that added up. The tool sharpener was one of the last truly itinerant trades in America, a direct descendant of the medieval tinker and the traveling craftsman. His trade began dying in the 1980s when mass-produced, disposable cutlery started flooding the market. Why pay to sharpen a knife you could replace for $2? Now we move into a different kind of work. Less physical, but no less essential. This is the world of what historians sometimes call the trust economy, the informal market that ran almost entirely on reputation, relationship, and the particular warmth of a neighborhood where everyone knew your name. Number 10. Taking and ironing and mending. Before permanent press fabric changed the laundry room, ironing was a serious, time-consuming chore. And for households where the woman of the house worked outside the home, or where illness or disability made the work difficult, there was always a neighbor willing to take in a basket of shirts and return them perfectly pressed for a fee. Mending went alongside this, replacing buttons, repairing seams, taking in or letting out clothing that no longer fit. These were skilled trades, as surely as any skilled trade that required a certification. The woman who did this work well built a steady client list that would keep her busy for years. By the early 1980s, the combination of easy care fabrics, cheaper ready-to-wear clothing, and the social shift away from household service work had quietly retired this hustle from most communities. Number 9. Informal neighborhood childcare. Before the era of licensed daycare facilities and background check requirements, the neighborhood childcare provider was simply a trusted woman, almost always a woman, who watched a few extra children in her home while their parents worked. She was not running a daycare in any official sense. She was just being neighborly, for a fee. $3 a day, maybe $5. For a family with 2 children in her care 5 days a week, that was a meaningful income. For the parents, it was the only option they could afford that also felt safe, because she was someone they knew. She went to their church. Her children played with their children. The collapse of this informal system came gradually, driven by well-intentioned but increasingly rigid licensing requirements that made home-based childcare legally complicated, and by the rise of corporate daycare chains that positioned themselves as the modern, professional alternative. Number 8. Avon, Tupperware, and the living room economy. It is easy today to look back at multi-level direct sales with a kind of knowing skepticism, but in the 1960s and 1970s, before women had broad access to traditional business ownership or corporate careers, direct sales was genuinely one of the most powerful economic tools available. An Avon lady or a Tupperware host was not just making money. She was building a network. She was developing sales skills, managing a customer list, learning to read a room and close a deal, all while operating out of her own living room. A productive Avon representative in a mid-sized town could earn the equivalent of $600 or $700 a month in today's money, entirely on her own schedule. The Tupperware party was both a sales event and a social institution. What shifted this world was the internet, which eventually offered women far broader avenues into entrepreneurship, while simultaneously giving consumers access to products without the need for a personal sales representative. Now we enter what I think of as the specialized garage, the world of higher skill, higher income hustles that required real training, real tools, and very often a willingness to operate in the gray area between a licensed trade and a casual favor for a neighbor. Number 7. Stump pulling. This one sounds straightforward, but do not underestimate it. Removing a tree stump from a yard was backbreaking, technically demanding work, and most homeowners had neither the equipment nor the inclination to do it themselves. A man with a tractor, a heavy chain, and the experience to know which direction to pull and how to avoid cracking a water line could charge $15 or $20 a stump in the 1970s, roughly $100 to $130 in today's money. On a good day he might clear 4 or 5 stumps before lunch. The demand was constant and the competition was thin, because not everyone had access to a tractor with enough pull. What eventually ended this as a standalone hustle was the arrival of the stump grinder rental market, which allowed homeowners to do the work themselves for far less than hiring someone. Number 6. Piano lessons. In an era before screens, before organized recreational sports consumed every afternoon, and before streaming services replaced the family living room as the center of childhood activity, piano lessons were a near universal aspiration among American families with any spare income at all. And in nearly every town, there was a woman, and it was almost always a woman, who gave lessons after school in her front room. She charged $2 a lesson, maybe $3. With 15 students coming through each week, that was a consistent, predictable income that required nothing but a piano she already owned and a gift for teaching. The decline of home piano lessons was long and slow, driven partly by the cultural shift away from classical music education and partly by the collapse of the piano in every home culture that had defined American domestic life for nearly a century. Number 5. Home baking and cake decorating. The woman who could bake a wedding cake from scratch and decorate it with hand-spun sugar roses and perfectly piped borders was, in her community, something close to royalty. And she charged accordingly. A tiered wedding cake in 1975 might sell for $30 or $40, the equivalent of nearly $200 today. Birthday cakes, graduation cakes, holiday pies and cookies, Christmas fruitcakes made in November and sold through December, it was a year-round business for those willing to put in the work. The kitchen was the factory. The mixer was the machine. The oven ran nearly every day. What shut this hustle down was not a lack of demand but a wave of county health inspections and cottage food regulations that in many states made it technically illegal to sell food prepared in a home kitchen, regulations that, in many counties, were only loosely enforced until they suddenly, arbitrarily were not. Number 4. Muskrat and raccoon trapping. This one will surprise some listeners, because it sounds more like a 19th century occupation than something that was happening in living memory. But through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, a skilled trapper in the right part of the country could earn serious money running a trap line. Muskrat pelts sold to fur buyers at 15 to 25 cents each at their lowest, and sometimes far more during good years for the fur market. Raccoon hides were more valuable still. A trapper who ran 2 or 3 miles of creek bottom, managed his sets carefully, and knew the land could pull in 60 or 70 pelts in a season, which, at peak fur prices, was real enough money to matter. The collapse of this hustle was swift and nearly total when the international fur market cratered in the late 1980s, driven by shifting consumer attitudes about animal welfare and a coordinated campaign against the wearing and selling of wild fur. Number 3. CB radio repair. Between about 1973 and 1979, citizens' band radio was not a hobby. It was a national obsession. Truckers had always used CB to communicate on the highway, but the oil crisis, the 55-mile-per-hour speed limit, and a cultural moment that produced hit songs and Hollywood films turned CB radio into something that tens of millions of ordinary Americans wanted in their homes and their vehicles. And tens of millions of ordinary Americans knew absolutely nothing about how to install, tune, or repair one. The man in your town who did know, who understood crystals and antenna impedance and sideband adjustments, could charge $10, $15, $20 just to look at a unit, and more to fix it. His garage was full of radios in various states of repair. His waiting list was months long at the peak. And then, almost overnight, the CB craze died. By 1980 it was essentially over, killed by the lifting of the speed limit, the rise of the telephone answering machine, and the simple exhaustion of a fad. The repairman's phone stopped ringing. His waiting list evaporated. And that particular niche never returned. Number 2. Small engine repair. We already met this man in the opening of our story, the one with the garage light burning late into the night. Small engine repair was, arguably, the most durable and the most lucrative of all the informal side hustles, because the demand never really went away. As long as Americans owned lawn mowers, chainsaws, rototillers, pressure washers, snowblowers, and go-karts, someone needed to fix them when they stopped running. And the man who could do that, who understood carburetors, ignition timing, valve clearances, and governor springs, was worth his weight in gold to every homeowner on his list. The smell of gasoline-soaked hands and the sound of a difficult engine finally turning over and running clean were his rewards. At his peak, a skilled small engine mechanic working out of a home garage could clear the equivalent of $40,000 to $50,000 a year in today's money, with no overhead beyond tools he already owned. What eroded this hustle was not a single technological shift but a slow accumulation of them, engines that became cheaper to replace than repair, and a generation of homeowners who no longer knew what questions to ask or who to call. And number 1. Custom taxidermy. Of all the side hustles on this list, this is the one that occupied the most unusual space in American culture, simultaneously an art form, a trade, a preservation technique, and a deeply personal service. Because when a man brought you the buck he had harvested after 3 seasons of trying, he was not bringing you a dead deer. He was bringing you a memory. He was asking you to preserve something that would hang on his wall for the rest of his life and tell a story to every person who saw it. A skilled taxidermist was an artist. He knew anatomy, he knew chemistry, the formaldehyde and the borax, the wire armatures and the sculpting clay. He knew how to set glass eyes so that they looked alive, how to position ears and pose a mouth so that the mount conveyed the exact energy of the animal in its last moment. A shoulder mount in the 1970s sold for $40 or $50. A full body mount for a large animal could reach $150 or $200, the equivalent of nearly $1,000 today. And in a culture where hunting was not just a sport but a way of feeding a family through the winter, the demand was constant and the waiting list was long. What changed taxidermy was not technology or regulation but economics. As commercial taxidermy studios grew and imported foam mannequins replaced hand-built wire forms, the price of professional work came down, and the informal neighborhood taxidermist found himself competing against studios that had both lower costs and better marketing. So here we are. 15 hustles that once formed the invisible infrastructure of small-town American life. And as you listen to this list, a pattern should begin to emerge. These were not just ways to make money. They were solutions to real problems, real needs that existed in communities where the nearest hardware store was 30 miles away, where the nearest daycare did not exist, where the nearest appliance repair shop would not make house calls and charged more than the appliance was worth. These informal economies thrived not because the people running them were cutting corners or avoiding responsibility, but because they were doing something that the modern economy largely forgot how to do. They were meeting their neighbors where they were, doing work that needed to be done, and building a reputation one handshake at a time. The man who sharpened your knives did not need a Yelp profile. The woman who decorated your daughter's wedding cake did not need an Instagram account. The trapper, the piano teacher, the engine mechanic, they were known. In the deepest, most fundamental sense of that word. They were known. What we lost when these hustles disappeared was not just a collection of oddly specific skills. We lost the confidence that a single person, with a good reputation and a willingness to work, could build something real. We lost the understanding that local knowledge, knowing the creek bottom, knowing the right carburetor jet size for an altitude change, knowing exactly how much cream of tartar keeps royal icing smooth, was worth something. Was worth a great deal, actually. The modern gig economy offers flexibility, but it offers it on someone else's terms, through someone else's platform, with someone else's algorithm deciding whether your work was good enough. The men and women in this video worked on their own terms. Their platform was their porch. Their algorithm was their word. And maybe that is worth remembering. Because the problems these people solved have not gone away. The engines still break down. The stumps are still in the yard. The cakes still need decorating. The only thing that has changed is that we stopped believing one person, working alone, with nothing but skill and sweat and a good name, was enough to meet them. They were. And somewhere, in some garage with a light still burning late, someone still is.